Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Kanstrom, and as Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy at BC Law School, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this excellent reunion program. For those who thought this session was entitled Pot and Party, I'm sorry, it's actually entitled Pot and Parity, so if you want to leave, this would be the moment to do so. And for the student who told me it was, quote, high on his agenda, haha, he may be rethinking that now. We at the Rappaport Center are enjoying our 5th year at BC Law School. I'm very happy to have taken over as faculty director from Mike Cassidy last year. Our programming focuses on important issues of law and public policy in many different ways. We offer a wonderful fellowship program. Over the summer, we host many conferences and symposia. We invite a distinguished professor to BC for a semester. This is a cohort that has recently included former Connecticut Governor Daniel Malloy, also a BC Law grad, as I'm sure many of you know, former SJC Justices Robert Cordy and Geraldine Hines, former U.S. Attorney Carmen Ortiz, and former Maryland Governor and candidate for President Martin O'Malley. This week, we're in the midst of a Senior Fellows program that has invited a diverse cohort of exciting, successful mid-career professionals, including academics, practitioners, and activists, to come here for a very intense one-week visit in which we learn from them and they get to know us, especially our students, with whom we hope they'll work and develop professional relationships and research projects. Our first senior fellow in this program was Brittany Saunders from the New York City Human Rights Commission and the de Blasio administration in New York. This week we've had Zephyr Teachout all week, a law professor and candidate for Attorney General and Governor in New York, who was endorsed by the New York Times and actually came close to winning, and lost in a close race to Andrew Cuomo. In 2 weeks, we're going to have Lance Freeman, who's a professor in the urban planning program at the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Please check the Rappaport Center website for all these events and lectures, etc. You are all invited. There is almost invariably free food, which might be a reason to attend if intellectual curiosity isn't enough to motivate you. Our programming theme this year has been equality, inequality, equity, and inequity. And as we saw the proliferation of marijuana dispensaries, new laws affecting cannabis, and controversies swirling throughout many communities, we also saw that many cannabis-related issues also deeply implicate these themes of parity and of equality and inequity. So we have a state legislature, the first licensee in Boston through the equity program promulgated by the Cannabis Control Commission, and a commissioner of the Cannabis Control Commissioner as well as one of the 2 Boston Globe reporters whose beat is the cannabis industry. Naomi Martin, our moderator, will be sharing a bit of the history and background of the industry and will place our program in context for contemporary society. As you came in, and you see on the tables in front of you, there are index cards. We're hoping that you'll write down your questions, and we'll be collecting them for the Q&A, towards the end of the program. If there are students here, you should please identify yourselves on the index card, not by name, but just write student, because we want to give priority to student questions. With that, let me introduce Naomi Martin, who is the cannabis reporter at the Boston Globe, who covers politics, business, and the societal impact of marijuana legalization. A Massachusetts native, Ms. Martin joined the Globe in 2018 after reporting on crime and local government in Dallas and New Orleans. She is a graduate of Tulane University. And let me also just say what a pleasure it is to see Jamie Eldridge back in the place where he got started. It's always an honor to have you back. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Vice Chancellor.
Thank you for that introduction. Thanks for having us. So, sorry, I'm just trying to. All right. So, before marijuana was legal, it was historically, racially, disproportionately enforced, meaning Black and Hispanic people bore the brunt of a lot of the criminal charges, and they got harsher punishments with sentencing and with jail time and pretty much like all aspects of marijuana and drug laws in general. But in Massachusetts specifically, Black people were 3.3 times more likely than whites to be arrested. And then I'm sure you're all aware that there's criminal justice disparities at every level, and so that ripple effect continued on. Voters in Massachusetts made history in 2016 with, sorry, okay. Can you hear me? Voters in Massachusetts made history in 2016 when they passed the first cannabis law in the country that included a statewide social equity mandate. It required the state to set up a cannabis control commission that would promote the full participation of communities that were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And that was the first state in the country to do that. And so that set up, so there was no expungement of prior crimes involved in that law, but there is a mechanism that was passed afterwards to expunge crimes. However, we've seen since then that only 30 people have been expunged, and those are crimes that could be any crimes. We don't know how many of those are marijuana related. And people can get their cases sealed, which helps with jobs, but it doesn't help with police and like child protective services and other government things. So that's one area that, so Massachusetts made history as the first, and since then we've seen other states sort of follow along and in that vein. And so Illinois recently passed their legalization bill through the legislature, and they actually included a more automatic expungement process for marijuana crimes to be cleared, putting the burden more on the government instead of on individual people. So that's one way that Massachusetts fits in. And then, but in terms of what the state is doing to try to right the wrongs of the past with that racially disproportionate enforcement, the state has two programs to try to bring people from those communities into the industry. The industry so far has over $300 million in sales, and it's been a very slow rollout. There's only like 25 to 30 stores in the state. Oh, hi, Mom. I'm like, who's taking a picture of me? Thanks for coming. So anyways, the state has, so they have two programs, and you'll hear a lot more about them. Kobe Evans is a member of one of them. It's called Economic Empowerment, and that was open for a few weeks last year, and basically it gives people who are in that program the right to skip the line when they apply for a license. And so that helps a lot with like paying for rent. You get, a faster process at the state level. It doesn't help so much, and you'll hear a lot more about this, at the local level, which in Massachusetts is a really big deal. The local governments here have a lot of power over who gets to become a marijuana business. Okay, and then another program that the state has is the social equity program, which is a training, mentorship, and assistance program, basically, not financial assistance, but just like help in other ways. And Commissioner Title has been very instrumental in getting all of this set up, and she's the social justice chair of the commission. The commission also has public safety, public health, and business finance specialists on it. So far, it's still really early. The state has also proposed or passed making delivery and cannabis cafe licenses exclusively for small businesses or social equity applicants. So that's another portion of this, is like trying to carve out pieces of the market for those smaller businesses. So now I'm going to turn it over to the panelists and give them a chance to talk about who you are, how you got into the industry, and specifically if you have a role to play in the social equity portion of cannabis, if you could talk about what your role is there.
Anyone in particular?
Oh, just each of you?
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I hope you're enjoying your reunion weekend. My name is Shaleen Title. As Naomi mentioned, I currently serve on the Cannabis Control Commission. So for those of you who are from out of state, that is the agency that is tasked with regulating medical and adult use marijuana here in the Commonwealth. It is a brand new agency created from scratch in 2017 for that purpose. And before that, I spent about 15 years as an activist working on marijuana legalization issues. And the timing was such that when we wrote the ballot initiative for legalization in Massachusetts around 2015, we were just starting to see the data come in from Colorado and Washington and Oregon, and seeing the discrepancy between those communities that have been harmed by marijuana prohibition for all of these decades and those people who were profiting off the industry. So that was really the impetus for all of these programs.
Hi. I'm not going to be good with getting this mic on because I don't do this.
I think it's on. If
Okay,
you
can you
your
hear me?
mouth closer, maybe.
Okay. My name's Kobe Evans, and I am the first economic empowerment applicant in the state to get a provisional license. I guess my background is in real estate, and as a person of color, an entrepreneur, there was a time back in 2016 when we knew that the ballot measure was pending, and we knew that people like Ayanna Pressley and at that time activist Shaleen, they were adding in components that had provisions for people like myself from the inner city, from areas disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. And so we knew that was on the radar, and so we kind of said it would be great if someone took advantage of it, because Massachusetts has a history of racial inequalities, economic inequalities, and I think that when they wrote the measure, they built in measures to correct things like that. And so we knew it would be a good opportunity, and so my partner and I decided to apply to see what happens, and a couple of years later, here we are. But I'm happy to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.
So good afternoon. I'm Jamie Eldridge, State Senator for the Middlesex and Worcester District, and a proud graduate of BC Law, so class of 2000, and really see the policies I've advocated for, especially on the social and economic and racial justice front, really influenced by not only my general education here at BC Law, but professors like Dan Canstrom, Professor Plotter, Professor Bloom, Professor Goldfarb, Professor Grossman. And so they really had a major influence in my time as a legislator, many other professors, but those are the ones that immediately came to mind. And I've been a legislator for 17 years now, including the Senate for 11 years, and really pleased to be here with Commissioner Title and Kobe Evans. And I think Naomi mentioned the referendum. So the 2016 referendum legalizing recreational marijuana for adults, that was something I supported, and just sort of have a framework of both why certain things have passed in the legislature and why certain things haven't, is that I was one of just, I'd say, 10 legislators that endorsed that referendum. So the majority of my colleagues, there's 200 legislators, were either opposed or they had no position on legalizing recreational marijuana, and there had been a series of decriminalization ballots before then. So I would say generally the legislature has been, unfortunately, fairly conservative in terms of cannabis policy, but I think we did make a breakthrough, is that once the 2016 ballot passed by a majority of voters, we passed legislation, creating the Cannabis Commission, including the mandate around social equity. And so I'm proud that we did that. I think it's accurate to say that the Senate really took the lead on the social equity pieces and trying to make it easier for individuals to open up recreational marijuana. As far as the disparities, I see it right in my district, is that the district I represent, 14 communities in Metro West. There are 2 prisons in my district. A significant percentage of people of color, and yet I have a majority white district. And so you see how sort of generally the mass incarceration has had an impact in Massachusetts, and that includes drug laws. We repealed a number of drug laws last session, but there's much more to be done. And so looking forward to talking about pending legislation around cannabis this session, but from the wider criminal justice reform lens, there's a lot of work to do, and I would say still the legislature is far too conservative around criminal justice reform out of fear of conservative voters, even though the majority of the public supports reform. So look forward to the conversation, and again, I want to thank the Rappaport Center for inviting me. I've actually had a number of Rappaport fellows in my office, so very big fans of the program. Thank you.
So now I'd like to just, if you could each go down the line and just say two things. One, what would success look like to you for the industry to be socially equitable? Like, how would that look? And then number two, how do you think it's going so far?
For me, success would look like the opposite of the school to prison pipeline, if you're familiar. And so what the opposite looks like is communities that have been harmed, that have been over-policed, that have been punished, arrested, incarcerated for using marijuana and other drugs at the same level as other populations, but having these snowballing effects throughout their life, that they would then be the ones to benefit. And that's in two ways, one of which is within my purview, which is the economic benefit of the industry, all the way from entry-level jobs to ownership, which is the way our equity program is structured, regardless of where you are on your career path. It's about taking that enormous wealth that is being created from this industry, the fastest growing industry in the country, creating thousands of jobs, and directing that wealth in a way that is fair back to those communities. And then the other way is reinvesting, whether or not you care about the cannabis industry and whether or not you have a drug conviction. If you're part of a community that has been treated that way, you could have no interest in cannabis whatsoever, but your community, in terms of the way that the government invests in it, should make up for the harm that the government did. So that's what I see as success. How it's going so far, we are obsessively tracking that because we were the first state to have an equity program, and now every state since, and it's happening very quickly, has also had an equity program and has largely used models from Massachusetts as its basis. And so that means we have to be really clear about what's working and what isn't. The economic empowerment program, as Naomi mentioned earlier, it was just about your place in line. And while it's wonderful to see that Kobe was the first and the only currently provisionally licensed company in Boston, which is huge, and he's an economic empowerment applicant, it still has been too slow. And so I think other states need to go further to look at our data and do better and be honest about what's working and what isn't. It's like all of these equity programs are in this R&D phase right now, and we need to perfect them. But it's much more important, I think, for us to be transparent and clear with that data and not worry about whether it's flattering or not, because this particular moment that we are all in, where we get to influence what this looks like as it's being developed, it'll influence generations down the line, and we'll never have this opportunity again.
Thank you. How's it going, right? How's it going?
What would success look like, and how is it going?
So success, I think that success is a measurement, and I think that with any measurement, you need analytics. And so I think that a measure of success would be some sort of metric around of all the applicants, how many of those are people from areas disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. I think without any metrics, it's hard to measure its success. And right now the numbers just aren't there to support a program that is successful, despite the best efforts of my colleagues to my left and right. I think that the program as it stands is hamstrung by some extenuating circumstances. So I think that.
And Kobe, I know you've talked about like generational wealth, and like I think that's an important part of like I think what some people want out of this versus like just having like people like you get the businesses, but also creating that like, I don't know, family wealth. And things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that inherently what happens is that in my space, you know, when as we're working on the build out of our shop and who we hire, it just naturally happens that we hire the vast majority of our contractors are from the community or people of color, and so you know the money that we spend building out the shop goes back into the community. People that we hire are from the community. You know, when we make charitable contributions, it's to the neighborhoods where we operate. And so, you know, right now, even before we have any revenue, the money that we are spending radiates out, you know, from the neighborhoods where we're from and where we operate. And then going forward, as we become operational, we will continue those core values to again maintain our responsibility to different organizations in the community and to hire people and also just to stem some of the statistics around the disproportionate wealth that people of color have in our community versus our white counterparts. And there was a Globe article done a few years ago that kind of highlighted the fact that, you know, a person of color in Massachusetts has a wealth of maybe $8, and their counterpart has a wealth of over $200,000, and that really stems from things like redlining and owning property. And I believe that when they wrote the ballot measure, it was again to try and correct some of those injustices. And then the second part was?
Yeah, how do you think it's going so far? I mean,
I think it's twofold. It's, you know, the intent and the ballot measure that was presented to the lawmakers was probably one of the more perfect ballot measures in terms of legalization that I've seen. Unfortunately, that ballot measure was turned into a law, and when they made it a final law, they added a component where local municipalities had control over who got a host agreement. And so, but the law mandated equity. Who got a host agreement did not mandate equity. So there's no way you can get equity as a product if the two parts don't honor the same goal. So right now you see the result is that you just don't get equity. The upshot is that other states are learning from our missteps in Massachusetts, and they are mandating equity across the board. So as other states roll out their laws, they're saying, well, we can't make the same mistake that Massachusetts made, and they're learning from it. So what happened here probably, hopefully, won't be repeated in other ways. So that's the upside, is that other states will benefit from what didn't work necessarily here.
great. And Senator Eldridge, what would success look like for you, and how do you think it's going?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would just say from a anecdotal point of view, you know, the district I represent, about half of the communities allow for recreational sales of marijuana to adults, but the other half, you know, banned the sale pretty much as soon as the bill became law, which speaks to some of the inequities that Kobe mentioned, because it obviously limits opportunity if dozens and dozens of communities, you know, you're not even able to apply, you know, for a license. And of the 3 or 4 recreational marijuana stores in my district, you know, which I've toured each one, they're all were started by or owned by, you know, as far as I can tell, you know, wealthy white investors. So at least in the district I represent, it's not implementing the social equity. And so I think there's a lot more work to be done. Commissioner Title is working incredibly hard to achieve the vision I think we're all trying to get to. I highly recommend you follow her on social media if you don't. She's outstanding, and she's really just each and every day at the Cannabis Control Commission advocating for the equity that certainly a lot of us are advocating for. But I think that the generational wealth gap and the racial wealth gap, which Kobe, you know, mentioned that Globe story, and that's from a Federal Reserve Bank report that I think was about families in Boston, saying that the average white family in Boston has an equity of about $300,000, and that the average white family has black family, has an equity of around $8. And so, obviously that's going to make it much harder for black or Latino entrepreneurs to start a business. There is legislation, maybe I'll talk about it a little bit later, that has been filed this session, to provide, a fund to help address that inequity. But I would say that the vision that I would like to see, again, just speaking for sort of my district, Metro West, we're really not seeing yet, and would really like to see, Latino entrepreneurs, black entrepreneurs, opening these stores throughout Massachusetts. So that's certainly the vision I'd like to see, and I do think there's a long way to go. As much as the referendum, did obviously advance things, the law advanced things, the implementation, especially from a financing point of view, is very challenging.
And so I guess since you brought up that fund, we might as well go to that question first. Illinois, interestingly, obviously they had the benefit of watching other states go first, including us, but they set up a fund in their law that would be paid by medical marijuana dispensaries that are operating in the transition before other businesses get to open for recreational marijuana sales. And that money that they're going to be getting from those companies, they expect to be like $30 million eventually, and they're going to be giving that as no interest or low interest loans to small businesses that are in the social equity program. And so Massachusetts, one of the biggest issues here, I don't know if you guys have heard about how there's not a lot of banks that are serving the cannabis industry because of federal prohibition. And they're regulated by the Fed, so they have to follow those laws pretty closely. So there's not a lot of loans happening. There is a lot of venture capital funding, but that tends to go to wealthy white people on a large, vast majority of it. And so I'm curious, I guess, first of all, Senator Eldridge, do you think a fund like that could pass? Because we saw one effort of it not passing earlier this year, and that was going to be funded by marijuana taxes, which I think is like maybe a tougher sell. You can talk about the politics of it, but I'm just curious, do you think Massachusetts would ever pass something like that for these types of businesses?
Sure, yeah, so thanks for the question. So yeah, there is legislation, an act to ensure full participation in the marijuana industry, filed by Senator Nick Collins and Senator Sonia Chang Diaz. They're both legislators for Boston, have really been advocating for this, and I support this. It was filed as an amendment to the budget, but because the Joint Committee on Cannabis was just beginning, it hadn't yet heard the bill. So that's why the proposal was withdrawn for the budget, because I don't think there was the votes yet in the Senate to pass it. I do think that there is growing support for the legislation. I think generally often the challenge in the legislature for any subject category is if the previous session the legislature takes on a fairly big bill, such as criminal justice reform or cannabis that were done last session, it's harder for the legislature to take up those subjects the following session because we're on to other topics. But I do think that there's growing support for the bill. What I'm thinking is that I'm hoping that this can pass either as a standalone or every session the legislature does a jobs bill and really is trying to emphasize the number of jobs that are created in cannabis. I will say in the district that I represent where there is recreational marijuana, it's created an incredible number of jobs, local tax revenue, and also benefit a lot of the other stores, so it's been a real positive. So hopefully that more of my colleagues that initially, sort of from a socially conservative point of view, just outright oppose legalization, will see that benefit and support the kind of fund to get closer to social equity.
And so in the absence of traditional bank loans, Kobe, how were you able to secure funding for your small business? And I think you have, is it 3 stores proposed or 2?
3 stores proposed.
And those would be in Boston, Medford?
2 in Boston and 1 in Medford. So we have 3 locations. We have 3 sites right now. We have 1 that is we're deploying now, and then we have 2 more that we're waiting for host agreements on. So funding early on, We were a little concerned about the potential of legalization across state lines. And so if that happened, the conversation that we had was, well, if we went into cultivation, what would that mean if if cannabis was legalized across the country? Would we be competing with Oregon, who had a different cost structure? And so we thought it would be really risky to get into a situation where we were cultivating and retail was just easier. There wasn't as much financial demand for retail. And so we were able to secure loans and credit card debt, and we kind of just did everything possible to get as much money together to get our store up and running. Luckily, the space that we found did not need major renovations, which was also helpful. So we were fortunate in a number of different ways, and I think that more so was just about being creative. And when you look at opening up an operation, most of your money is in the cultivation side of it. So once we decided not to go down that road, it just changed our financial needs, and that made it a lot easier. But there are people who are very supportive financially because it's a great industry, so it wasn't hard to convince people.
And did you have any people who were trying to, I guess, be exploitative with money at certain points?
Yeah, I mean, that's incumbent in the industry. I mean, the industry, a large part of the industry in many states is built on this exploitative relationship between big cannabis companies and local owners. And I think there was a recent case in Pennsylvania where one company took advantage of someone as a straw owner to own. It's all about market share. So they try and get as much market share one way or another, and so that's very normal. We had dinners with companies, and only to find out that they were really just trying to put us on salary and take over our business, and that wasn't. We've had many conversations like that, but that is that's just the way the industry is as it is. So.
And Commissioner Title, what is the Cannabis Control Commission doing to help equity applicants navigate the funding process?
So, as an activist, I'm always trying to think bigger than just what the commission can do, and I think this is something where if we don't work on it on all levels, federal, state, and local, we won't get there. But the commission has a couple things. So we can't directly invest or loan to the entities that we regulate. That would not be appropriate. But we can come at it indirectly from a couple of ways. So one is our equity program has a technical assistance component. And for entrepreneurs, they take a class in how to raise capital. And a lot of that helps make up for the unevenness in privilege, where if you just come from a certain community or you have a certain background, that information is readily available to you, and it may not be otherwise, especially when it comes to something like cannabis, where it's not very straightforward or easy to find that information, and it's always changing. So if you qualify for the program, you get that advice free. Then we advocate as much as we can for bills like the one from Senator Ching Diaz and Senator Collins, and we try to make it clear that having access to capital is a necessary component to having these programs be successful. And then finally, what I think of as like market-based encouragement, which is if you are a rational, self-interested economic actor and you don't care whom you're helping, but you just want to get your return back, we want to make sure that these communities that we're trying to encourage are an attractive investment. So one way we do that is with exclusivity provisions. So if you think that delivery straight to consumers is a good business model and you want to invest in it in Massachusetts, for the first 2 years, your only choices will be those businesses that are in the social equity program or the economic empowerment program. And similarly, there are many cities, there are a couple of cities that have taken steps like that to try and make sure that members in these programs have priority at the local level. And I think when you combine all of that, and then at the same time you don't give up on the long-term fight, which is that we definitely need to pass these bills, that we have a real chance at having a pathway.
Another top issue facing non-corporate backed entrepreneurs is the local approvals process. Sorry. So as Kobe mentioned, there's this thing called a host community agreement, which is a requirement to apply for a state license. And it's a contract. In the contract, the company agrees to pay a certain amount of money, usually about 3% of revenues, and that's what the cap is supposed to be to the town or city that they're going to be in, and that's supposed to offset the cost of having the business there. And then the town and city is supposed to document those costs, so we will be looking into see what those costs are. So in any case, so that's been a big sticking point for a lot of these businesses, just because the towns and cities, like Kobe mentioned, don't have any incentive in a lot of cases to care about smaller businesses, and they, often go to the businesses that are offering them more donations, more payments. They have better consultants and lawyers and people who can sort of sell their business a lot better. Not to mention political contributions. So, Kobe, what's been your experience in Boston and other cities trying to get a host community agreement? And what have you heard from other economic empowerment applicants?
So in Boston, in certain smaller cities and towns, it's more of a wild west situation. In bigger cities where, in Boston, it's just such a big city that the mayor isn't necessarily super focused on this host agreement situation. In a smaller town, this is everything for a local politician. So there's been more parity in Boston. And so the pathway hasn't been as difficult in Boston. In smaller towns, there's a political risk involved in co-signing on the adoption of cannabis. In Medford, for instance, we were kind of buoyed by Tufts University and all the students there who voted overwhelmingly for cannabis in the town. But Medford overall is a very conservative town. So the mayor in Medford is, trying to conduct a balancing act between what the voters voted for in her political future. So it's a little more of a challenge in Medford.
And just to say, because I've talked to you about this, but Kobe's been spending $5,000 a month paying rent on his place in Medford since when?
January?
Yeah, without any sense of when it's going to come to a resolution.
Yeah. So, it's beyond a challenge. It's frustrating. It's frustrating as a voter, because I voted for an level playing field, and to be kind of left out and with not even with no end in sight, with false promises, and it's a challenge. And so what I've heard from other people is that their stories are worse than mine. It's not funny. So I mean, I'm fortunate in Boston, and I am here not because I started the process before anyone else. I'm here because I was fortunate enough to get a host agreement. But there were others that came before me who were sidestepped in the whole process because the local politician had promised, favorable opportunities to a bigger company with more financial capital. So the hard part is that everyone in every single town has their own battles, and no one necessarily has the same battle because we're all dealing with different municipalities, different individuals. So it's not this collective movement where, we come together and we can just combat one enemy, if you will. Whatever I'm dealing with in Medford is different than someone in Springfield, is different than someone in Fall River, is different than someone in Brockton. And so that's the challenge, is everyone has their own individual story of coming up short or running into a brick wall.
And I would just echo to add on to what Kobe said, is that in the district I represent, which includes mostly suburban or rural communities, and so for Boston, maybe a host agreement isn't really that much money for the town or city's bottom line, but, in my district for the town of Ayer, town of 5,000 people, to get a payment of, $200,000 or $300,000 is a very big deal. And unfortunately, more often than not, the Board of Selectmen, the town manager, they're looking at just the bottom line in the finance, and they're more often than not looking at it through a social equity lens, nor are the residents really looking at it through that as well. It's just about, how much revenue can we take from this business, and they're not looking at the bigger principles behind the law that was passed.
And Senator Eldridge, do you think the legislature is going to act on this host community agreement issue? Because I know we've seen a bunch of bills filed over it, allegations of unfairness and favoritism and payments going far beyond the 3% in the law to nonprofits and the police department and all these other payments. In addition, we saw the mayor of Fall River recently get federally indicted for, and this was obviously an egregious example, but he was taking a lot of cash from the marijuana businesses that were trying to get host agreements in his city. And that made a lot of the legislators and the governor say, well, there's something wrong with this picture when it's just up to one guy to decide this, when there's so much money at stake. So what do you think is going to happen? I mean, do you think there will be any changes?
I do think there's a chance for at least some clarification of what what was in the law passed by the legislature. So I do think that's possible, just to sort of get a sense of the political dynamics, which are somewhat, obvious. Is you'll have the Mass Municipal Association, most boards of selectmen or town or city managers, oppose this because they say you're going to limit our ability to get revenue from this applicant. So I mean that's the political challenge, but I do think there's growing support for clarifying the host agreement in the legislature.
And Commissioner Title, we've seen Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville make efforts to give social equity applicants an advantage in their approvals process. And even in Cambridge, and I guess Boston is considering this as well, but Cambridge recently passed an ordinance that would give 2-year exclusivity to equity applicants and small businesses, which has actually led to a lawsuit in Cambridge by the medical marijuana dispensaries there. But what do you think will be the impact of those efforts? Do you see that spreading to other cities and towns, and what do you think will happen?
I do see it spreading to other cities and towns. I think that change comes from people who are willing to step up and be leaders in the beginning, and it's hardest in the beginning. Senator Eldridge was one of 10 legislators who supported legalization just a few years ago. This host community and local approval problem is the one thing that I would change, the first thing I would change if I could go back, because it has completely impeded our equity efforts. And we have had cities and city associations just say outright, well, we don't have any mandate for social equity. You do at the state level, but it's your problem, so you're out of luck. So when we have a few cities that are willing to step up, like Cambridge and Somerville and maybe Boston, it presents a model for positive change. And there's different ways that you can do it. There's also the city of Uxbridge, which I had never heard of Uxbridge before I became a commissioner, but when I reviewed their host community agreements, I couldn't believe how fair they are. They're just fair. They don't have an equity program at all. They're just like, if you want to have a business in Uxbridge, come in, and just like the law clearly intends, if you read the law, the business and the town come up with an agreement, and they make sure that there are no costs imposed upon the municipality. The business is supposed to cover those. That was the point of a host community agreement, not to be able to just sell your local licenses to the highest bidder. And so if you look at Uxbridge, you'll see they have micro businesses. They have a woman-owned business who was the first non-priority applicant to get through the process, and she is completely self-funded, and she was able to do that because of how fair Uxbridge was to her. There's another city or town, Maynard, which signed a host community agreement without a location, which provides a way for a company that can't afford, millions of dollars immediately for real estate and the right lobbyists to at least get their host community agreement first, and then they can start the process. So when localities are willing in different ways to do something besides just worry about their own revenue, we've seen that really work. And thus far, there's no government entity that has been willing to hold these businesses accountable, including my own. I've lost count of how many occasions to review these agreements. So nobody is reviewing these agreements at the government level, but it's public scrutiny and the media and the people who were willing to go and talk to their government officials and say, I want the marijuana industry in our locality to be fair, that has led to a few of them now starting to be more fair, like Uxbridge and Maynard and Cambridge and Somerville. So we just need a lot more of that, and we need to keep talking about it loudly and clearly.
So we've seen some pretty intense neighborhood opposition to cannabis stores, including in Brookline after the shop there, which is the only easily accessible one in the Boston area right now, became one of America's busiest pot stores, 2,500 customers a day. The national average is like 120 a day. Kobe, what types of responses have you received from neighbors of your planned store in Dorchester, and how does that differ from what, other communities might be feeling?
I think there's a nuance in terms of community response. I think overall that there are a lot of people who are accepting of cannabis, and they may not just want another business in their neighborhood that's going to see 500 additional people a day, 500 additional cars. So it's hard to separate the two. There are some people who are afraid of just the traffic. There are some people who don't want to see this quote unquote scourge of, what their idea of a recreational user is. And so it's hard to discern, when people say we don't want it in our neighborhood. There are people who don't want, Dunkin' Donuts in their neighborhood. There's people who don't want a new apartment building in their neighborhood. It's hard to really tell what their opposition is. And some people are just emotional about it, So that's the hard part to answer the question, is that, it's not, every person doesn't have the same argument. But I think that we live in a very progressive state, and, people, maybe the majority of people just have some sort of, objection to cannabis, but a lot of people just don't want the traffic. A lot of people don't want the dynamics of their neighborhood to change. And mainly what I hear is we want cannabis, just not in our neighborhood.
And Senator Eldridge, what do you think can be done to lessen the neighborhood impacts from these cannabis businesses?
Well, I would say generally a way to educate, municipal officials that if, they're only focused on the bottom line or, what that host agreement is, that they're really thinking short term, because, I would actually suggest, and I think it's been pretty much proven in the let's see, 3 communities in my district that right now have recreational marijuana, is that yes, the host agreement was nice, but it's actually all the increased commerce from just having that store in the community. People going to more of the restaurants, or going to the downtowns, or going to other stores from having that cannabis store, and therefore to make the entry for an entrepreneur into a community as quick as possible will actually dramatically increase revenues across the board, and not just looking at the host agreement. And I think it's also, quite honestly, electing more municipal officials who, and of course legislators, but who are thinking about it more through the social equity lens, and how do we end mass incarceration, how do we address severe racial injustice problems that still exist here in Massachusetts. And I guess I would say I actually don't think Massachusetts is, at least the legislature, is particularly progressive. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. I think that's changing over the past 4 or 5 years, but I think it's still a fairly conservative institution in terms of embracing new ideas or new policies.
And Commissioner Title, a lot of consumers are very frustrated with the lack of legal stores to go to, and they feel like if more stores were open, then you wouldn't have 2,500 people going to Brookline because they'd be able to go somewhere closer. What do you say to those people? Like, do you wish it was going faster?
Yeah, I say you're right to those consumers. Of course they're right. And it's very ironic that what is causing, to the extent that there are legitimate issues with locations, it is related to the big crowds, and that would be lessened if we had more stores opening. So then it's partially on those localities to move forward, but it's also partly on the commission to speed up our processing. That's the most frequent piece of feedback that I get. And we've been very, very careful with the licensing process, and you haven't seen any big scandals, thank goodness, but I think we do want to make sure we're making that as efficient as possible, and speeding up the licensing process isn't just good for those impacts on neighborhoods, but it's also really good for the social equity aspect for those who are waiting and paying costs. So you should see an improvement in that soon.
Okay, so Massachusetts is far behind other states on expunging people's pot records. California and some jurisdictions in Illinois and Colorado have taken it upon the government to expunge all the previous pot convictions. And in Massachusetts, a person who has that type of conviction has to go to court and file a petition. And it's not that hard, but it does take, some expertise and some knowledge and just like even figuring out how to do it. And so I'm curious, Senator Eldridge, do you think the legislature would ever pass an automatic expungement bill? I know there's one filed by Boston Representative China Tyler that would put the burden on the government instead of on individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, Naomi, I think you mentioned earlier is that, in the criminal justice reform package we passed last session, which was arguably the biggest reform, I'd say, 40 or 50 years, there was an application or process for expungement, but very few people, have actually benefited from it. So it should have been stronger. My view is that I think it will be difficult to pass this bill filed by Representative Tyler, mostly because, unfortunately, Governor Baker really has not been a strong proponent of criminal justice reform. There's a strong argument he's been doing everything to slow down the law that the legislature passed and not implement reforms around prison conditions, solitary confinement, et cetera. So I think it would be difficult to pass the bill just because I could see him probably threatening to veto this bill. So he's generally been an opponent of criminal justice reform, and so given that this would be in that category, and he was also opponent of the 2016 cannabis referendum, so I think it would be difficult for the bill to pass this session.
And this will be my last question, and then we'll be opening it up for y'all's questions. So if you could, I guess, start writing them down, and I can walk around and get them, or someone else might. Okay, so the legislature is now considering a bill to prevent employers from firing workers just for testing positive for marijuana without evidence that they were impaired on the job. This is in response to several food service employees who have spoken out about losing their jobs after getting hurt on the job and then being forced to take a drug test, even though there was no evidence that they were actually high at work. So I guess, Senator Eldridge, do you think that...
You can see the pivot of discussion. Yep, go ahead.
Do you think that this... Well, I guess, first of all, what is the opposition to this? Because I think that's something that people wonder. And then what do you think are its chances?
Yeah, so I'm a co-sponsor of the bill, fully support it, and to me it should be a no-brainer. So I'm actually hopeful that we can pass that bill because it and I think is very sort of nonpartisan and common sense. And I think the challenge again is just that often the legislature, once it takes up a subject in some form of comprehensive manner, it's difficult. Unfortunately, it's very frustrating for the legislature to revisit that issue in the next session. But I do think there's a chance we could pass that bill. And I think it was a Globe story profiling the person who got fired from the food service business. And it was just outrageous. So I think we should pass it.
And Commissioner Title, what are, I guess, your thoughts on people who are suffering the impacts of drug testing?
I agree with Senator Eldridge. I think it's just a really clear-cut, common sense issue that if you are not impaired and you're at your job, but you would fail a drug test because you have used THC in the past weeks, of course that shouldn't affect your job. That's just ridiculous and it's cruel. But what I think is really notable about it actually is that now I think most people agree, but just a few years ago, if you said that in a size crowd like this, you would have a good number of people who would say, well, what if it's your child's school bus driver? Even though that doesn't make any sense, because if a school bus driver is impaired, obviously that's illegal and a problem under all circumstances. That's the response that you would have gotten. Whereas today, because the stigma has lessened a bit and people have heard stories like that old woman who vaped once and got fired, people are more open to it. And just the other thing, the last thing that I think is really notable, my senator, Senator Lewis, was the primary opponent of legalization in 2016, and he is the one who filed this bill. Just wonderful, because he has been so open to constituents and saying, okay, I didn't support legalization, but if it has gone through, let's make sure that it's fair to everybody. And it just goes to show you shouldn't give up on anybody as a leader.
And actually, on that front, just about, people being able to use a legal substance, we've seen, like the YMCA, for example, posted last year on their door that if they smelled marijuana on any parents, they were going to immediately report it to Child Protective Services. I'm curious, Commissioner Title, are you hearing anything about parents being, or caretakers being like penalized at all for using marijuana, even though there's no evidence of child abuse?
Yeah, I hear that anecdotally, which is concerning because the cannabis law specifically prevents that from happening. But I've learned just because something in the law is in the law doesn't mean it's going to happen that way. I think there's a very strong impetus on people that if you hear stories like that, you need to report them, because something like the YMCA, that's what happened. There was a huge outcry about it, and then they apologized, and then they reversed their policy. So little by little, if we keep talking about this, and we keep talking about how cannabis patients and cannabis consumers are just people who are doing legal things like everyone else, then those things will change.
Some of you have really good handwriting. Some of you could work on it. Okay, I guess this one will go toward Commissioner Title. Is there a typical recreational user, and is this different from the general public's perception?
Oh, what a great question. Is that from a student?
They didn't say. You guys did not follow in the instructions. Or if you did, maybe no students asked a question. But anyways, I don't know. They have neat handwriting, though.
Yeah, so it's a great question because it actually segues really well to what I was just saying. No, there isn't a typical recreational user, and I think there never has been, but people haven't been as willing to be open over the years, and now they are. And I do think it makes a very big difference in policy and impact when you're willing to come out of the closet, so to speak, because when someone like Bernadette, that woman who was fired, when they talk about their stories, and it's not, the young, stoner that you see in the news footage, with like a tie-dyed shirt, it helps you be more open-minded. And just sorry, in case they wanted me to answer that statistically, it is the average cannabis patient is, I think, a male in their 40s.
And Senator Eldridge, how supportive has the governor been in efforts to pass other cannabis-related legislation?
I'm not aware of him supporting any pro-cannabis legislation, so I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, I would say that he hasn't been supportive. So.
Okay, this one, I don't know who wants to answer this, but I'll just read it. A lot of marijuana and drug-related policy changes follow the same pattern. 1, we can't do this, the sky will fall. 2, we do it. 3, the sky doesn't fall. 4, everyone moves on.
I think that's a statement.
How can we break through this paradigm to pass more common sense legislation? I guess Commissioner Title, I know you've been working on drug reform for a long time, so do you see any evolution in this, or is this just our destiny?
think for a second.
I think it's our destiny. I was randomly watching PBS one night, and one show ended, another show started, and the second show was random about how Boston built the first subway system. And when they started to dig underground at Park Street, people lost their mind. They said, you can't dig underground. There's demons down there. You don't know what's down there. And it was like these two fighting groups regarding just digging underground. And then we legalized gay marriage, and it's the same hysteria. And then, 10 years from now, we'll have happy hour, and it will be the same. So I don't think that we'll ever get past that.
So my theory of change is actually not to persuade anybody of anything. It's to find the people who already agree with you, which is probably more than you think, and mobilize them. And in the case of drug policy, that is so true, because our leaders and our elected officials are with exceptions, are way behind where the people are. And that's how it's been in all of these different areas, not just marijuana, but Narcan. I mean, right now, it's like completely accepted, right? Police officers and firefighters carry Narcan, and you see ads for it on the street. But it's just like that question said. When it first came out, people said, you're going to enable drug users by bringing them back to life after they overdose. People acted like that was the worst thing that could happen. And it was led by the people. So find the people who already agree with you and mobilize them.
Okay, we have a few questions about the illicit market. So there was a 60-minute story about farmers getting bogged down in paperwork. I think that was probably in California or Oregon. Oh yeah, the story was about California, which leaves those growing illegally thriving. Are there any stopgaps in Massachusetts? And I'll just piggyback on that and say, do you see any sort of parallels between what's happening in California and Oregon and here?
I don't see a lot of parallels because the environment is so different, and the risk of oversupply like they have in Oregon is just, we just have the opposite problem here for now.
But we do still have a thriving illicit market in the sense that there aren't a lot of legal places to buy. So I guess, what do you think should be done about that?
What do I think should be done about the illicit market? So research is very clear that what makes people switch from the illicit to the regulated market is price, access, convenience, and what they appreciate about their person that they've been using for years. So I think it's on us as the commission and the government in general to make sure that we keep opening stores and that prices go down and that we have things like delivery and that people want to switch. Because honestly, we can't make them through prohibition. It doesn't work.
Can I add to that?
Of course.
Just to dovetail on that, California is its own animal. Like California has its own set of circumstances that create its illicit market. In fact, the country was probably built on the back of California's illicit market. Oregon is a unique circumstance. They allowed for the sale of cannabis without any regulation, and then they tried to regulate it after the fact, but it was out of the bag at that point. In Massachusetts is unique and not similar to the other two states. So, as Commissioner Title said, the best way to stop diversion, the best way to stop, kids under 21 from getting access to cannabis, the best way to kill the illegal market is to have a robust legal market.
Okay, this question I think is from my mom, but I'm not positive because I think I recognize her handwriting. Why not just, and sorry if I outed you.
Is it for you or?
I know, right?
Why not just enact a tax at the state level to benefit minority neighborhoods, like cigarette taxes? So I guess what she means by that is, are we sure that this is the best way to get at the goal that we're trying to get at? Is that what you meant? Was this your handwriting? Sorry.
And I'm sorry, what is the question? I didn't.
So why not just enact a tax at the state level to benefit minority neighborhoods, like similar to a cigarette tax?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, as far as a consumption tax, I mean, those are actually borne more by working families, so that would probably be a burden, you know, on working families across the board. You know, my view is, you know, raise taxes on on the rich or close corporate tax loopholes to fund programs. So I'd much rather see that than another consumption tax.
This one's for Kobe. When do you anticipate that your retail stores will open, and what effort did you find most difficult getting the financing or negotiating the financial aspects of the host community agreement?
So our final license is predicated on an inspection and then a letter of recommendation that goes back to the Cannabis Control Commission. So I don't think we'll get.
Letter of recommendation?
Well, a letter from the inspector.
Oh, okay.
A letter from the inspector that goes to the commission. And I believe you guys are meeting in a couple of weeks. And then, so I don't think we're gonna make that mark, so probably in the December meeting, hopefully we'll have our inspection in the next few weeks, and then hopefully in December. And then the second part of that was,
Was it harder to arrange financing or negotiate the host community agreement?
in Boston, because they've done a few of them, so it was a boilerplate. There was no negotiating. It was just sign the host agreement. And in terms of funding, again, we don't really, you know, it was all debt, so there wasn't a lot of negotiating in that aspect of it. So that was pretty straightforward.
And was it financing from like a credit union or from like?
No, friends and family.
Friends and family.
Yeah, because we didn't need a ton as it turned out, so the terms, you know, are pretty straightforward. I mean, we want everyone to be happy, and then, you know, there's statutory limits in terms of what you can pay back, so it was pretty straightforward.
Okay. This one is for Commissioner Title. What effect do large national marijuana companies have on purchasing minority-owned marijuana businesses?
What effect do they have?
Sorry, what effect do the large national marijuana companies have as to purchasing minority-owned marijuana businesses?
I'm going to answer the question that I think that they're asking, and then you can raise your hand if that's not right. So there is definitely a predatory breeding ground that exists in every state, including ours, when you pass an equity-related law, and then it's clear who would qualify. And as I mentioned before, we're trying to have market-based benefits for those groups. Predatory organizations come and swoop in and, like Kobe was talking about before, try and just make them essentially salaried positions. So in Massachusetts, we have very strict ownership and control limits. And I see that as being part of the other side of the coin of our social equity provisions, because it's a huge industry and there's room for big and small companies, but eventually it is finite and there has to be some limits. So that's in the law, so we enforce that, and we'll continue to enforce that. I think also we have to be vigilant about enforcing it, but making sure too that we're not taking away the autonomy that every business has. So if you qualify for these programs and then you decide you want to sell your company, of course you have the right to do that. You might lose the benefits you're entitled to if you're selling it to someone who doesn't qualify, but of course you can always sell your company. So we have to balance those things, and we have to make sure that the law is not being broken in terms of the limits, and then we have to just keep providing benefits to those small businesses and minority-owned businesses and women-owned and veteran-owned businesses that we want to encourage, and that the law makes us encourage. So does that answer the question? Seeing nothing, I'll say yes.
What role should the other cannabis companies in our state play in supporting equity and empowerment programs? So, anyone?
What role should the big companies play?
Yeah, just other cannabis companies.
It's a delicate dance. you need the capital to start the business. You don't want to put too many demands on the bigger companies, but there has to be some ownership from someone just to stand up a business. And so I think it's tough to, unduly burden another company with responsibility that they may not own. I think that it really comes down to more the integrity of the law in which it's written, to have a fund or to have maybe a balance where you have 20% of the market goes to minority owners, 80% or 50-40, some sort of mix so that there's equal representation, and then couple that with funding from an agency, from a state, from taxes or something like that. But I think that, there's a kind of understanding of, kind of laissez-faire business opportunities where you don't encumber another business for the benefit of someone that they aren't responsible to, but they are indirectly.
I can add to that too. So one original thing that Massachusetts did is every licensee has to provide a plan, a diversity plan, and then what's called a positive impact plan, which is how you will give back to those communities. And the only requirements are that you have to specify your goals and how you'll measure them. And so it's largely voluntary in a sense, what exactly you end up doing. And some of them are just nothing, and some of them are terrible, and we send them back because they're not specific enough. But some of them are great. Some of these companies have really gone out of their way to step up to the plate and give back in unique ways. So one thing we saw is Sierra Naturals, which is a dispensary in Cambridge. They started an incubator, and they have an economic empowerment participant that created products that they then sell. Theory Wellness has a grant program for social equity participants who can't raise capital any other way to be able to apply and get funding directly from Theory Wellness. And we continue to see more innovative and creative programs.
Those are all the questions I got. Oh, I'm sorry, one more. Please, the effect of, I guess please talk about the effect of the black market on both medical and recreational stores and the business in general. So, Kobe, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, do you see the black market as a competitor when you open?
No, I think that, even if we look at the current issue with vaping, from what I understand, and maybe the commissioner can correct me if I'm mistaken, is that a lot of those issues came from black market cartridges. And so
The CDC has said that, most of them, yeah.
Okay, so there's integrity involved in the product that people buy, and some people worry about what their black market product is contaminated with, if you will. And so there are concerns with people going to the black market in terms of, the integrity of the product. And some people want a lot more assurances that there's no pesticides, that there's no mold, there's no bacteria. And so just to have a healthy experience and not to necessarily be waiting on the corner at 10 o'clock at night for some person to show up, so people want a different experience. And so some people are cost driven and they're always going to seek, a lower price product, but some people want a different experience that will ultimately diminish the effects of the black market.
Just to briefly add on to that, and if you want to hear me talk about vaping forever, you can follow me on Twitter. But just briefly, these vaping illnesses are really serious, and it's the exact wrong opposite thing to do, to take away the ability to regulate at that exact moment, because by taking away that ability to purchase tested products, you are sending people back into the illicit market, which is exactly the source of the dangerous products.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we've seen other states, we've seen no other state follow Massachusetts with a total ban on all vape sales, nicotine and marijuana. We haven't seen any other state do that, but we have seen other states take more targeted action at the THC vape pens. Do you wish Massachusetts would have done something like that, where you're regulating more the chemicals that are allowed to be used inside of them?
Yeah, absolutely. And we had announced a plan for that in early September before all of this started, when we were starting to hear about the illnesses, to require, this is now in effect, to require a full disclosure of all of the ingredients that are in vape products, whether they're active or not. And as more information comes out from the CDC, we can ban the certain ingredients that are starting to look problematic.
Does anyone else have any more questions? I know we have like 5 more minutes on the time. Yes.
I've heard that some of the large law firms are starting to set up practices for cannabis. Who are they representing?
And not, I mean, they're large law
Probably the
firms, so
wealthy
wherever the
investors.
money's at. I mean, it's a lucrative, there's a lot of money to be spent, and you're gonna see a rollout across the country, across the world, so, yeah, it's a big business.
Yeah, if there are lawyers in the room that are wondering if that's a good practice area, it absolutely is. It's growing really fast, it's interesting, and the barriers to entry are actually pretty low, because even if you're like an entry-level lawyer, if you learn the regulations quickly, you'll be seen as a thought leader very fast.
And also, again, there are bigger firms that are setting up practices. We need smaller firms as well, so across the whole spectrum, there's a need to be filled.
Oh, sorry. Super important. If you're a lawyer that wants to provide pro bono services to social equity participants, you can go to our website, masscannabiscontrol.com, and click on social equity.
That's great.
Yeah, and people always say about cannabis that like it's like a month is like a year. So if you've been in cannabis for like 6 months, you're like much further along than you would be in another industry at this point. People who have been in the industry for like 6 years are considered like, old timers at this point. So it's kind of interesting in that sense. Does anyone have any other questions? Yes.
I just want to know, what percentage ownership do you have to have in your company to be an economic empowerment applicant? 51?
It is 51% of the owners, so it can be any number, but you have to comprise 51% of meeting the qualifications. That's also on the website, masscannabiscontrol.com.
Okay, and then after you get your application, if you sell that interest, is there any benefits that are lost?
That's a more complicated question. I can talk to you about it afterwards, because it really depends on when and who you sell it to and what program you're in.
Any other questions? Yes.
Last night I actually sat with a law firm, Boston-based, that has a cannabis practice for 6 years. And they actually, so to answer the question, what do? They actually represent individuals, groups of individuals that go into the business and try to navigate the legal system. I'm a commercial lender, and they're trying to educate commercial lenders on how to lend to and get into lending to the cannabis industry. Unfortunately, federally regulated institutions cannot lend to the cannabis industry right now. So what this law firm is doing is actually setting up funds from private individuals to lend to the cannabis industry. So hopefully they stay away from usury laws and lend at reasonable interest rates, but at some point, federally regulated institutions and banks will see the light, because they said to us, when you take on the deposits, and there's KYC process, and they would come on as consultants and help us navigate the KYC process. But it's a Boston-based firm, and I do have the name if people want to know.
Awesome. Thank you.
Compliance.
Alrighty.
We want
Well.
to know what a KYC process
I know, right?
Oh, what's a KYC process?
Money
Oh.
laundering.
Thank you to all.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for coming. Thanks to these amazing panelists. There's a reception after this, right outside.
Thank you. Well, that's okay. That happens in the union nights. So, yeah, so nice to meet you. Thanks for organizing this. We'll be with my card. Yeah. My card. See if I can really help. How are you? Good to see you. How you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Nice to see your friendly face. Hi, Jay. So great to meet you.
Handwriting.
We work very closely together.